plants exhibit in this year's virtual picnic day event. So flowering plants in the tree of life are over here, and their closest relatives are the gymnosperms. So to begin, I want to say that flowering plants are incredibly diverse. There are around 300,000 recognized species. They're found on all continents, even Antarctica. And here we just have a really small snapshot of just the amount of diversity, both in form and in color, that you can see across the flowering plants. So a lot of this diversity in flowering plants has been attributed to the relationships between flowers and their pollinators. So flowers are reproductive organs, and their primary function is to attract pollinators, to move pollen between individuals and ensure reproductive success. So switching between pollinators can result in new species of plants being formed. And I'll go over a little cartoon example here. So here we have columbines. Columbines have these nectar spurs, which are specialized petals that are filled with nectar, but only at the base. This makes it such that only pollinators with specialized morphologies, such as long tongues or long beaks, can reach them. So here we have a hummingbird, which has a long beak, and it's able to reach the nectar. So hummingbirds can act as effective pollinators in this species of columbine. You can see this hummingbird can visit these different flowers and transfer pollen between them, allowing the plants to reproduce. However, suppose we had a new columbine, or a columbine that evolved slightly longer spurs. In this case, the hummingbird's beak would be unable to reach the nectar at the base, and the hummingbird would not be able to pollinate this new flower. However, the long tongue of a hawk moth would allow it to pollinate this species of columbine. The hummingbird is unable to reach the nectar at the base of these really long spurs, and these hawk moths would rather not forage from a flower that has this sort of position, hanging downwards. And because of this, these two populations of columbines become reproductively isolated, which results in them becoming new species. So this example is sort of a harmonious relationship between plant and pollinator. The plant produces a reward, in this case nectar, and the pollinator allows the plant to reproduce successfully. However, not all relationships between plants and pollinators are this harmonious. For example, a lot of flowers can be really tricky. So some plants produce flowers that trick pollinators and don't offer any reward. And around 5% of all flowering plants utilize this sort of deceit pollination. And that might not sound like a really big number, but if we go back to earlier when I said that there are around 300,000 species of flowering plants, this amounts to around 15,000 species that utilize this trickery. And I'll go over a couple of examples. So here we have a poroglossum orchid. These plants attract flies to their flowers using scent. When the fly lands on the lip, so it's this specialized organ on the flower, the lip will snap shut, forcing pollen on the temporarily trapped fly. And over the course of minutes to hours, depending on which species of poroglossum, the fly will be released, allowing it to visit another flower. And this is what the flower looks like with the lip snapped shut. Here's a video that I took. So pretend that this mechanical pencil is a fly. See there, the flower snapped shut. And looking at it at 10 times slower than normal, we can see that, let's wait for it. You can see here that the snapping is still quite quick. So you can imagine that this would really effectively trap a fly in there, allowing it to pollinate these flowers. Another really cool example of deceit pollination is the California pipevine. So this plant is found only in Northern California, and you can actually find it around here in Davis if you go along Puda Creek. So these plants attract fungus gnats to their smells with the flower. These plants attract fungus gnats to their flowers with the smell of fungus, and the flies become trapped within the twisted flower. So it's called a pipevine because it's sort of shaped like a weird contorted pipe. And the gnats will be trapped within this chamber. Here's another video. These are a couple of gnats that are trapped inside the flower. Actually, it might not seem like there are that many flies trapped in here, but from my observations, I've noticed that around 30 to 40, I've usually seen around 30 to 40 gnats that are trapped within these flowers, which is really interesting given how small they are. So we look at the cross section of one of these flowers. So we cut across here in this top of the chamber, we can see that around the reproductive organs, so here is the part that produces either pollen, or produces pollen or receives pollen, we see this lighter region of the flower. This will allow sunlight to pass through, and the gnats, being not that bright themselves, will think that this is the exit, so they'll continuously fly towards it. And in this process, they'll get covered in pollen such that when they eventually escape, they will be ready to move this pollen to another individual flower. Another example of a plant utilizing deceit pollination is the Titan arum. So this plant produces a giant cluster of flowers that can be up to 10 feet tall. So note that this is not a single flower, even though it might look like one. It's actually many, many flowers together in a stem. These flowers presumably mimic a corpse as they smell really bad, and they attract carrion flies and beetles. And to even further maximize their smelliness, they'll actually generate heat. So if you look at a thermal image of this group of this cluster of flowers, you can see that in some parts of the tip, it can actually reach temperatures of above 90 degrees. And you might imagine that this whole process uses a lot of energy for the plant, both producing a giant flower or a giant cluster of flowers and producing heat. And yeah, that seems to be the case, as these plants have a really unpredictable blooming schedule. They seem to bloom once and then not bloom again for many years, maybe even up to a decade, only producing a giant leaf each year. So to end this talk, I'm going to speak a little bit about one of, in my opinion, the coolest systems of pollination. So this is a really unique relationship between a plant and pollinator. The pollinator in this system are orchid bee males, and they collect a reward unlike any other reward, just the smells of the flowers. So they collect these smells in their specialized hind legs. As you can see here, this is sort of like a pouch. And they'll use these smells when they perform courtship displays. And the flowers that are pollinated by these bees are called perfume flowers. So they smell strongly, and they also don't produce any other rewards. So they don't produce nectar. And a lot of, as these are called orchid bees, you might imagine that a lot of the plants they pollinate are orchids, and that seems to be the case. So here is one species of orchid that's pollinated by orchid bees, has a really interesting shape, and doesn't produce any nectar. So here's a video of another species of orchid that's pollinated by these bees, and you can see that the pollen transfer just occurred. It happens really quickly. The flower sort of launches a projectile onto the bee. And if we look at it at a quarter speed, pay attention here. Yeah, there it happens. And each flower has a different location where it places the pollen on the bee. And as you can see here, it sort of has this opening in a pouch where the bee lands. This is all to ensure that the pollen of each flower lands at the correct part on the bee, such that the bee will be able to deposit the pollen on other flowers of the same species. There are around 200 species of orchid bees that are present in Central and South America, each with its own sort of distinct set of chemical preferences. In turn, there are around 1,000 species of plants that are only pollinated by these orchid bee males. This is really testament to the role of pollinators in driving reproductive isolation and speciation in flowering plants. So I hope you enjoyed this talk. Thank you for attending. My name is Jason, and here's my email if you have any questions. And please check out some of the other talks that we've prepared for this event. Thanks again.